All right, we are live. Welcome everybody to another EvolveLAB Live. I am very gifted and very excited to talk to Dana. Is it Filippi? Is how you say your last name? I want to make sure I get it right.
You know, I feel like in Italy, it was probably something really gorgeous, like Di Filippi or something amazing, but it's De Filippi. It's very Americanized.
Really? That is so cool. So you have an Italian background then? Is that right?
I do. But at Ellis Island, you know, like everybody else, they, I'm sure, butchered the spelling and the pronunciation and everything else.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Not cool that they butchered the spelling, but cool that you have the Italian background. I'm also Italian. I have my mom's maiden name's Coco, and so I think they came back from Italy and all that. That's great. Now it's a very boring. Took my dad's last name, which is Bohemian, just Allen. So it's less elegant than your name. And but super glad to have you on, Dana. Thanks so much. I know you from the internet. I've seen and followed you on Twitter and some of the presentations you've done. And then obviously you and I are in some of these different meetups and things like that with some of the Autodesk groups. And and then you've launched your Dynamo channel and super excited about that. And I thought it would be awesome to have you on and just talk about your background and what you're doing with Dynamo and Dynamo Player. And there's so many awesome opportunities there. So I really appreciate you coming on today. So
thank you so much. Honestly,
yeah.
I'm super flattered to have been asked to come on, and I'm, obviously same situation, right? It's a very small industry of us BIM peeps, right?
Totally, totally, 100%. So yeah, we all kind of know each other, at least peripherally, and then we all see each other at the conferences, which it's been a bummer, with COVID and all that crap, that we haven't got to see each other and bump shoulders again, but looking forward to things normalizing as much as they can and doing that again. So for those that don't know Dana is an associate and BIM technologist at Smith Group, also host of DanamoBIM. By the way, I love the branding around that. That's very cool. One of the things I've noticed, Dana, is that your background and the places you've worked at a few different places, and all of them always seem to be kind of a more technical role, I was noticing. So I noticed your degree and your background's in interior design, but everything has always been like Revit manager or BIM manager, kind of in that domain. It seems like, do you kind of naturally gravitate towards that in that role, or why do you always kind of go towards that bent, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, absolutely. Super interesting question. And I obviously am super excited whenever I find someone within the industry that gravitates towards BIM, and I feel like I can take them under my wing. I love that because it's kind of rare, right, to find someone who doesn't want to be an architect and do the architectural things, which I completely understand. That's why we usually go to architectural school.
Totally.
I went to Virginia Tech actually after getting my associates at the local community college in business, and I took a lot of electives for art and pottery and different things like that. And I wanted to figure out a way that I could be creative and make money. Essentially, is why I pushed to interior design. And I actually minored in industrial design, which was super cool. I in my office right here, I have to the side that you can't see because it's super messy with corks and a Dremel and glass that's broken and all of these crazy things I just love playing with. You can kind of see on my mantle, I've got a really weird array of things.
That's awesome. Do you do 3D printing or laser cutting or anything like that?
Yeah, I have what's called a Cricut, if you've heard of that. It takes DXFs or SVGs, and you can essentially, it's a printer with a blade, and so it cuts 2D kind of things. And so I make pop-up cards and really cool things with paper. I do resin crafts. I really just dabble with everything. My dad's an auto mechanic, so he pretty much has every power tool possible. Recently, I convinced him to buy an excavator. So just playing with toys is so much fun. And I feel like that's, the curiosity in us BIM managers is really what I find so intriguing. But I was lucky when I went to Virginia Tech in that I took an internship at AECOM right after my sophomore year. And when I was there in their interior design department in Roanoke, Virginia, and I was actually there during their acquisition. We all know AECOM acquires quite a bit, right?
Yep, totally.
So small firm acquired by AECOM, which was cool to see that, especially in college, right? So they took me through a week-long Revit training course, like really devoted a lot of time to my education and, not only design and, we did like a drawing session every Monday, and it was really, really cool. I was really lucky. So when I went back to Virginia Tech, the program chair at an interior design department was like, "Oh my gosh, Revit, you're going to teach it to everybody." And I was like, "I don't know Revit. What are you talking about? I took a week course." But that, I just kind of became the Revit girl. Everybody was coming to me with questions, and I ultimately would just figure it out and help, like, why isn't my ceiling showing? Why can't, like different things like that. And so I just kind of naturally gravitating being the Revit support girl in college, which was super interesting, just like for that to have happened. So I graduated in the recession, totally aging myself now, not to say I'm old, but giving you an idea of how old I am. So 2010 recession was dreadful. I luckily got an internship at HOK because the program chairs and everybody else that was, super supportive and wanting to give me references on how, great I was in terms of giving the knowledge with Revit and just really being that support, which of course we in the industry rely on, right? The network of people, the community, etc. So they took me on for a summer internship. Amazing group of people, Trayvon Price in DC, love him. And I was also working with Peter Marchese, who's a consultant at Microdesk, senior evangelist at
I know
Microdesk.
Peter.
Yeah, amazing guy. So those two guys right out of school took me under their wing. And it was amazing. And I was just, being that girl who was just like, well, how do I do this in Revit? Why are we doing it that way? Like asking and pushing all of those buttons in terms of like, and they're like, who is this girl that just got out of college? And, so after the internship ended, I actually contacted Peter and I was like, Peter, you're consultant. You go to a lot of different firms. Do you know any firms that are hiring in this horrible recession? He's like, no, but Microdesk is. So I essentially went on and was a consultant with Microdesk, which was super cool because I was able to go to a bunch of different firms, look at a bunch of different templates, see what people are doing, really get that exposure in terms of what the industry is doing and what the problems are, how some of those problems are being addressed, etc. And just really enjoyed it. Found an opportunity in DC after I was a little tired of traveling that essentially they were migrating from MicroStation to Revit. And so I was like, oh my gosh, you don't have anything in Revit? Let me write it for you. Right? Like it just seemed like the
clean
best.
Slate.
No families to clean up, no libraries to have to maintain that are existing, like none of that. Everything was fresh. Like it was ideal.
Totally.
At that point, I actually started looking at some of their occupancy workflows. And at that point, especially, even up until now with Revit 2022 and the key values as shared parameters and things like that.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So that pushed me into looking at Dynamo to push some of these values around and so forth. And that was kind of the start of the Dynamo path. And so shortly after that, I actually took a position with Smith Group that really has allowed me to embrace the computational side of what I do. So I essentially work with all the different groups. We're multidisciplinary at Smith Group, MEP, civil, landscape, architectural structure, all the different things, except contractor. We don't do the build side of things.
Gotcha.
But it's
you're
great.
Full service house where you're at right now. You have everyone
exactly.
Yeah.
So I get to tinker in the systems tab, and even I have Civil 3D downloaded on my installed. So it's just really, really pushing the buttons in terms of what some of the problems are and how we can find solutions in an automated way.
I love it. That's so cool. I love that you were talking about Dynamo and the occupancy side. And I remember I was taking one of Marcelo's class at AU, and it was one of his practical examples for Dynamo.
That taught me Dynamo.
Yeah,
those
me too.
Early 2014. I literally attribute Marcelo to my Dynamo knowledge.
Totally.
Early on.
Yeah, and I remember being so inspired in his class where the dots started connecting that I literally opened up my laptop like in his class, and I was thinking about that occupancy workflow that you were talking about, and I was like, oh, it's just like a simple get set parameter like exercise, and so like that was like, yep, right there. That's awesome. Very cool. I love it. Cool. And then so now you're at Smith Group, and you're talking about you get to embrace computational design. I'm curious because I was having this conversation with Ryan Cameron and kind of the debate about like, well, what is computational design? Is computational design even a thing? And so there's like different people have different takes on that. I'm curious, like, what is your thoughts on computational design versus like generative design, visual programming, etc. Like, where does one stop and another one begin, in your opinion?
That's really, really interesting because it's all coming full circle. I actually just recently had a conversation with Marcelo on my YouTube channel, shameless plug, DanamoBIM, where you guys can check that out in real depth in terms of, what computational design is and how we, get this out to the masses, right? How do we really make this a thing rather than an idea? And a few of the takeaways from that was, if you look at, of course, the definition, if you were to like Google computational design, it's basically just mining data, utilizing data in a logical way to inform design in some way, right? So in essence, based off your question, you could say that generative design is just a facet of computational design, right? We're using the computer in some way to give us, or to utilize logarithms and other formulas to basically produce an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, there's so many, right? I mean, there's the different sustainability side of things with the solar and lighting and heat gains and outside air calculations and all of these different things. There's of course, the geometry and, typically what we think about when we started thinking about, computation, especially from the architectural side of things, the twisting towers and the, different things like that we can generate from a computational algorithm, right? And then, more onto the terms of what we've been referencing and occupancy and different practical Dynamo uses and stuff like that. We have more of the pushing and sharing of data, right? How can we speed up our documentation process to utilize the data that already exists in BIM, right? And push that along, use that, share that with our consultants internally, what have you. So one of the few things that Marcelo and I had discussed was maybe, in addition to a BIM kickoff meeting or in, part of the BIM kickoff meeting, maybe a section of that is talking about computational tools and how computational tools are going to be utilized. I think we've gotten past the idea of, is computation useful for this project? Yes, it is. Right? We can check that box. We're going to use computation in some way, but how? Right?
Totally.
Is that going to be in the early design side of things? Is that going to be with solar analysis or other types of analysis tools? And sorry for all of these out there. I am obviously slighted towards the architectural side of things. So, but of course, in MEP, a lot of things are formula driven, right? They're based off of calculations, slopes and like I mentioned, outside air calculations and different things like that. And especially now with COVID and sensoring and, all of these different things and how we can get all of that. Fire dampers at firewalls, all of these different things that we can push around in the model. So I think first off, it's getting to the teams from a top-down perspective, right? Not necessarily just to the person pushing the buttons in Revit that's doing the work, but also from the people who are tasking those actual activities and assignments. That to say, there's an automated way of doing this, right?
I love that.
In addition to that, I think that we, need to start integrating this into our standard workflows, right? Whether that's with a BIM kickoff meeting or a BIM execution plan, some sort of integration of computational tools into that light, that might make the most sense because I think it is very project specific,
Yeah,
right?
totally. Which might be a good segue. I don't know if you have some examples you want to show, but I have some questions about that because I remember when I was a BIM manager at a firm, and I was starting to write all these Dynamo scripts and starting to get them rolled out. And I wanted to start doing like some training on some of these tools. And I remember, quote, our principal telling me, Bill, we're architects, we're not programmers. Like, I don't understand like the use of this, tool.
Like makes me scratch my head. Like,
Yeah, exactly. It was like, well, it helps like automate processes, like if you're doing this one thing, we can write a script that helps speed up that process. And so that's why I felt like Dynamo Player is one of those areas where, I would open up the graph and start showing the firm, and it was before pre-Dynamo Player, and people were kind of nervous about like the spaghetti mess, and it felt kind of like overwhelming a bit, and trying to pitch that, in your comment about you being a BIM manager, so much of that is psychology too, right? Like in trying to figure out like how do you lower the barrier to entry for people to start using some of these tools, which I think Dynamo Player is such an incredible opportunity for that, if you agree. And so I don't know, can you comment on that? And maybe like, I always like to talk about like challenges I've had, as a BIM manager, and failures I've had as a BIM manager. And that was one of them. Like, it was like, I was really struggling at like, okay, how do we get this rolled out to the firm in a way that we start getting adoption, people actually using this tool? Can you comment on maybe how Dynamo Player does or does not help with that process?
well, that's a super loaded question. To back up a little bit, I would say 100% to what you're alluding to, that documentation is probably the most important part of my job, right? I can create tools all day, but if they're not documented in a way that people know that they exist and know how to use them, they're almost useless, right? So I think documentation should be in the forefront of how we create tools. We must document our tools, and we must update documentation as the tool updates. I think it's really, really important. And me being the type of person that is, at Smith Group, the person that you're going to call, I want it documented, right? I want to be able to send you an article or whatever it might be, that will help you guide yourself through this workflow. And hopefully at the end, if you have questions, that's when you would contact me.
Gotcha.
Or if, you're having problems for whatever reason. And of course, that communication is open. So to that, I will say that kind of two things to that. Autodesk up until this point hasn't been really wonderful inside of Dynamo Player in terms of linking resources together, allowing subfolders, those types of things that make Dynamo Player a little bit more easy to interface with and easier to understand from a outside perspective, especially for those of us who don't know Dynamo, right? And when you accidentally hit that pencil button in Dynamo Player and you open up the Dynamo graph, you're like, oh my gosh, what did I do? This looks crazy, right? So I think, I think we can hope for and based off of what we've seen with some of the generative design tools and things like that, with what some of the product teams are doing, I'm super hopeful that we're gonna be seeing some really wonderful additions, if you will, to Dynamo Player that make it a little bit easier for the general user that's within Dynamo Player to be able to understand what this script does, maybe have a subfolder in terms of like general documentation versus discipline specific documentation, so on and so forth.
Yeah, Saul and the team's doing some pretty cool things there.
Yes, absolutely. And so, that is super awesome to see those types of things come onto board, is without a doubt going to change the game, even more so than it has, right? Because Dynamo is obviously, a Dynamo Player in particular is a game changer.
Totally.
And I'll go ahead and share my presentation, if you don't mind. Get my here within our screen share.
Should be at the bottom there.
In the bottom.
It says share screen.
Sorry, I have so many windows open too, which doesn't help, right? Oh, I think you have to enable it. Maybe that just means that I'm not sharing yet. Okay.
There you go.
Sorry about that technical glitch.
It's
all
all
of
good.
these new ways of streaming and things, I'm sure everybody understands.
Yep.
Okay. So you can see here, I actually have a little kind of GIF running here, and it basically is just showing what this script does. This script in particular toggles that checkbox for annotation crop toggle. And based off of this specific script and the way that it's been set up, it actually will update the annotation crop toggle on all of your views. So the next one here changes case. So based off of a category and a parameter, it's going to change case for you. So just kind of showing some of the practical uses of how we use Dynamo Player. You'll see here that we have a few things that make Dynamo Player really wonderful. We have some inputs. These allow for the user to really customize the script specifically for their use, whatever that may be for their Revit model, right? Maybe you want to update sheets one day, but another day you want to update rooms, right? So making it flexible enough to work on many scenarios. And I will say, working at Smith Group or working with a multidisciplinary firm, the amount of possibilities opens up really, really, exponentially. Because not only from the architectural perspective, I'm thinking about how this tool can be used, but this tool can also be used in the electrical engineering discipline, right? Or in landscape, right? So how may they use this tool differently? Just thinking about some of that. Obviously, we can update it as people give me feedback, right? So not barrier of entry at all.
So quick question on that, or maybe you'll get it. Okay, you got the inputs. That's what I was going to ask. Yeah, so you have inputs in here.
Yeah, so with that, and once again, knowing that we have those two key things here, the inputs and the outputs, right? So here would be that toggle. Are you applying the annotation crop toggle or not? And then the outputs basically showing you what happened.
That's great.
In the change case, we have, what category are you updating? What parameter are you updating? What case are you making that? Notice there's 3 options. And then, of course, once again, the outputs in terms of what's changed. Now, I will say that the outputs are really wonderful because, once again, sometimes our scripts don't always run completed. They run with errors regardless of what we do. Right? Bill, you've been there, right? It's like,
yes,
I've tried
100%.
to put this warning out so many ways. And at this point, I'm just leaving it. It's a waste of my time.
Yep.
So providing outputs to show this script worked, even though it says ran with warnings, really, really helps inform the user.
So it gives them some kind of insight that something like it worked, but there might be a warning somewhere. So maybe just double check it.
Exactly. And I will also say that a lot of because once again, the documentation is so important. In the documentation that I provide with most of the scripts, some of the scripts don't really require documentation. They might just require a GIF or, something like that to show how they are used. But if, it is kind of imperative for documentation to exist, then those types of things are really important to note, right? That, this script will run with errors, ensure that you fill all this out, and then go and check the schedule to make sure that after the script ran, it did what you expected it to.
Totally. And I like that you're using GIFs too, because that helps it like visually tell the story versus just like static imagery. That's very cool. Slight digression, what are you using for your GIFs, not for capturing, but for hosting? Are you using an HTML or like how do you host those GIFs for your documentation?
I actually will do a lot of just inserting into our web pages. Like the GIFs are actually supported in our web pages that we share internally on SharePoint.
Oh, nice.
And PowerPoints are really wonderful because you can just, insert those types of things as well, or do a screen recording within PowerPoint itself. So you don't actually have to create a separate file that you're linking in. So it knocks down a few steps there.
Heck yeah, that's great.
But a lot of Camtasia too, because sometimes you'll actually need to export it out as a specific GIF file or GIF, depending on how you want to say it. So a few tips when it comes to creating inputs and outputs. First off, sometimes we only need to provide a Boolean, right? A one or the other in terms of an option. So for example, with the annotation crop toggle, you'll see true or false. Do you want it cropped or don't you want it cropped, right? So a Boolean is really wonderful for this. And for those of you who do not know, we're going to right click on this Boolean to make it an input right on the node within Dynamo. And that will essentially make it an output, an input rather, and display within Dynamo Player. Also notice that I've renamed this node. Luckily, within newer versions of Dynamo, it actually tells you it's renamed now.
That's nice.
Super nice. But I usually will annotate either within the group or with a note what that node was originally. And, you know, this title that I've renamed it to is actually what's going to display in Dynamo Player. So it won't just say Boolean, right? That would be super confusing.
Right. So whatever you rename, it shows as your input there in Dynamo Player. Great.
You got it. So usually we'll ask a leading question that's, you know, true or false in nature.
Right.
You know, so.
Yep. And then so as part of this, then you can hide basically all the rest of the graph from the user and just give them their inputs and their outputs for them to be able to see and fill those out to run the script. And so they're not overwhelmed by all the rest of it. They just need to know what those inputs, and this is how you set it up.
Exactly. Exactly. Nice. So the kind of behind the scenes, how we actually do this to make it all work within Dynamo Player, if you will.
Right. The analogy I always use is it's like a mechanic in a car, right? Like I'm a horrible mechanic. I'm like the least like mechanically inclined person you'll ever meet, but I know how to drive a car, you know, so I might not know how to work on the engine and lift up the hood.
Sure.
And so you're in a sense, the mechanic, like, you know what's going on under the hood, but the end user just needs to know how to drive the car, turn the steering wheel, put in their inputs, etc. And this helps facilitate that process.
Wonderful analogy. Yeah, exactly that. It's like me and my dad, right? I'm like, Dad, it's making a knocking noise again.
Yeah.
All right. So in this particular scenario, I'm providing essentially a conditional statement to basically give two different lists, right? So in this specific Boolean, I'm asking the user, do you want to use areas or rooms? So in this case, I'm actually using a conditional statement here that's being fed by all elements of category from both of those.
Ooh, I like how you're doing that. That's great. So then you don't need to have a separate script, one for areas and a separate one for rooms. They can choose that.
You got it. You got
awesome.
it. And then if that script needs to change, now I have to update two, right?
Yep.
And now I have to provide documentation for two scripts.
Yep.
So
totally. I love that. That's
trying to
awesome.
cut it down to one is pretty huge.
Yep.
The other one that we saw with the change case, actually, rather than just two options, the Boolean option, we actually are providing three options, right? And of course, this could be more, right? Maybe you want to give an option for all of your disciplines. Are you architectural, engineering, landscape, civil, etc.? And in this specific scenario, what I'm doing is I'm essentially doing a list.create that, based off of the user specifies, gets that item and index.
Nice.
So kind of doing the work beforehand to get my lists and get them in the kind of case in which all of these integers reference. And then the get item and index would actually retrieve the list in which they specify with that input.
That's great. I like it a lot. The thing that I like about a lot of these examples is, you know, like if you see any kind of marketing around a lot of this stuff, it's like Twisty Towers and other things, where this is, again, to market Marcelo a bit, is the practical use cases. So you're using all these really practical use cases for these scripts, and then giving the end user options. This is so cool.
And once again, it provides that conversation at the beginning that says, it's not a matter of if computation can be used. It's a matter of when, right?
Yep.
Maybe, you're not going to have a really heavy design side of things. You're going to move into construction documentation really quickly, right? Maybe we can move over to a lot of these computational documentation related scripts much faster than maybe
Love
the
it.
twisty towers.
Yep.
Right.
Love it. Also, while you're continuing on, if anyone wants to chime in the chat, if you have questions for Dana, please chime in there.
I would love to segue from this too. If you guys want to see something else.
Yeah, this is great. Keep going unless we have other comments, but I think this is really good. And one of the questions I have for the group as well is like, are you guys using Dynamo Player, and how many of you guys are using Dynamo specifically? Are you guys using Dynamo and then using Dynamo Player to streamline processes at your firm? And how are you guys leveraging Dynamo and Dynamo Player? That's a question I have for the group. So feel free to throw that in the chat window. But keep going, Dana. This is great.
Yeah, if you are, right? I would love to hear if you guys are. I will say shout out to Mustafa and the Data Shapes team, the Orchestra team. I don't use them. Smith Group, we have a development team that helps me a lot with, getting a lot of the resources that Orchestra provides for you. But with that being said, amazing. I've done a lot of interviews with Mustafa. Check him out. Check out Orchestra with a K. Really, really wonderful stuff.
Totally.
One of my favorite tips, for whatever reason, when you're editing a note name, so remember we kind of said that the note name is going to actually what appears within your Dynamo Player. So once that gets renamed, it won't be just integer slider. It will be whatever you've changed it to. One of my favorites is, unfortunately, that doesn't allow for line breaks natively. So when I edit the node name, I can't do a line break. Even with Control Enter, you know how you can do that sometimes within a Revit parameter, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Right? Even though it kind of like messes up your schedules a little bit. But with this, unfortunately, and hopefully, come on, Dynamo, catch up. So with essentially what I do is I update the group name with line breaks, because those are fine. The group name lets you have line breaks all day. Then copy the group name into the node name.
What?
And copy of the break works great.
The copy works, but you can't just type it in. Really? So that's a nice little like Dynamo hack there.
And you can see this is actually so much more easy to read and intuitive, right?
Yes. Very interesting.
So that's this new. Is one of my favorite tips.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's great.
And something I just figured out along the way,
Yeah. Yep. I love it. Real quick, one thing, the Matrix, like where Neo like bends the spoon, like he has to bend the spoon. I always call like Dynamo like where you're able to bend the rules of reality, right? You're bending the spoon, you're bending the rules. And now you've taken another step further, Dana, where like you're bending the rules of Dynamo. It's like, well, you couldn't do this natively, but using that copy paste hack, you're actually able now to bend the rules of Dynamo. That's great.
Right. Just finding little Easter eggs, little hacks.
I like it.
So tip 4, if it isn't a user input, hardwire it. And essentially what I mean is that if this script is always to work with sheets, hardwire it. Do not use the dropdown. And the reason that this is because in different versions of Revit, there's different amount of categories. So views in 2021 actually just blanks out in 2019 because there's not that many categories. I feel like I didn't explain that very well. So essentially, like, let's just say there's 100 categories in Revit 2021 and there's only 80 categories in Revit 2019. That views selection within 2021, the line may be 91, which doesn't exist in Revit 2019 because there's not a 91st category.
Right.
So Dynamo Player doesn't recognize this, and the script just will not work. So if kind of like in the change case where I want the user to specify which category they're updating, leave that as a dropdown, make that an input. But if you don't, hardwire it. And the way that we hardwire it is by doing a code block with the name of the category, of course, in quotations, category by name. And that essentially does the same exact thing as the categories, except once again, it's hardwired. It will always be views.
Right. And this is
like
interesting
kind of a
too.
Fundamental thing.
Yeah, I love how you're doing that, and that way it's always views every time. This is a really good best practice as a comment too. So you have to do the category by name though versus a different node. So this one where you're saying all elements of category, then you pick a category. This is category by name, and then you're specifying the name of that category in your code block.
Exactly.
Okay.
And because we've all seen when you open up a Dynamo script and like these are grouped right here, like the actual category drop down, and it says, make sure this is set to rooms, right? Or whatever it is, because across different versions, it jumps around.
It does, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I love seeing those notes though. Give me those notes.
Right.
So definitely something that you want to think about, especially if you're supporting multiple versions of Revit, which we all are, right?
Yep. Yeah, really good tip. I like that.
The last tip that I have, and it seems like we're getting some questions, so I definitely want to get to those. But the last tip that I have is kind of like what we were mentioning, especially when we do have a run complete with errors. Use watch nodes to display results, right? Once again, as you can see there with the first asterisk, especially if the script often generates warnings. And a little tip here, the watch node has to be renamed in order for it to show up in Dynamo Player. You can right click and you can make it an output, but unless it's renamed, it will not show in Dynamo Player. This is definitely something that if you got the metrics on like the Google and Dynamo, this is probably one that's pretty common, right? Like, why won't my watch node show in Dynamo Player?
Because you haven't renamed it. You have to rename it to get it to show it.
You got it. And so you can see there, the watch output comes out. Now, one thing that and this I guess could maybe even be like a tip 5.5 is when you have a script that fails, sometimes, especially when you can predict why it might fail, provide that within your output. So you can actually see here, and you can see it highlighted, my user typed it in wrong, right? They had caps locks on or something, and they typed in the parameter names incorrectly because of their case. You can see when they ran that, it says, no elements updated. Check to ensure parameter/parameter value exists as specified. Case sensitive, right? So now the user is like, oh, yep, look at that. I misspelled it. They rerun it. It works perfectly. And guess what? I don't get a call.
Right?
Right?
So you provide like some parameters, no pun intended, like some breadcrumbs, like for them to be able to say, okay, it didn't work. What can I do to make it work? You have notes within the dashboard, if you will, of it to be able to say, oh, try this instead.
And it is a little bit, to get into the Revit side of things a little bit, it is a little bit, I would say probably just as heavy as, the actual, formula itself, the creation of the script and what it does. So let me share this PowerPoint that I have in a separate thing here. So this is the script, right? It's, getting drawn by and the parameter to be updated. But this is actually what is giving that output, what I refer to as the reporting aspect of the script, which you can kind of see feeds off the page over here. So the meat of the script itself isn't really that much, but the reporting is doing quite a bit of work. So you can essentially see it's, is it null? If it is null, then give them this warning.
Oh, nice.
If it's not null, then give them the actual elements that passed, which aren't null, right? So not complicated, right? But just a little bit more nodes than we need. I also, worth noting, I use a Python script a lot of the time for a conditional statement, because the if conditional statement built into Dynamo breaks with empty lists. It's really fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're using Python to do that. So Rob has a question that I'm wondering if some of this reporting helps with this. Rob's asking on YouTube, he's asking, he has some big issues with Dynamo with several things happening, but not in the chronological order he'd like. It causes problems. Any tips? And yes. I'm wondering, if sometimes when I've used Dynamo, I get different results sometimes, and closing it, opening it helps. Some of these reporting functions might help. But have you experienced that where sometimes you run a script and there's a chronological order that he'd like, but it's not giving him that?
So sometimes, let me know, Rob, if this is what you're explaining, but sometimes we'll need to do step 1, update the crop region. Step 2, rename the view. Step 3, right? And it's awesome if this could be in one script rather than having to break it all out. And now you have 3 scripts that the user needs to run when it could just be one, right? So essentially, while Dynamo is opening, I talked to this. What we can do is we can essentially do the workflow that we would like to complete first. So let's just say I want to grab rooms, right? And the category by name. And maybe I want to, I don't know, update their comments. Once I do this, what I can do before I do the next step is I can just update these really quick. Oh, I need to get all elements of category. Missed my node there. Of category, because the category doesn't have a parameter called comments. There we go. Okay, so now I've updated all the rooms to have the comment of X. Now, before I do the next step, what I'm going to do, Rob, is I'm going to type in end transaction. I think it actually comes up better with just transaction. And essentially what this does is it ends this transaction. Now, these elements have been completed, and whatever I do to them, going forward assumes that this is done. Probably would have been better if I put this into manual mode, right? Because now it's in a cycle probably. So now I can say, let's set their, I don't know, their description to be comments plus their type name, right? But comments needed to be set first before this next step. I think that's what you're asking. So this end transaction is essentially where I would now force these elements, and then that transaction is done. Now, one thing to mention about this is that it's going to, once you write a new value, so maybe I'll update, I don't know, is description an instance parameter to room? So we'll do X plus.
And while you're doing that, Dana, Rob does say, awesome, that helps. He's used to programming with line numbers, different thought process.
Yep, totally get it. Now we can say, what's the comment? Get the comments and force that into the description, right? And once I run this, now it will say, okay, I got the comments. Those have been updated. Now I'll update the description if description is an instance parameter, which it isn't, of course. And then it would actually provide 2 Dynamo transactions. A transaction is essentially like a task that Revit completed. So by
it's finishing one task before moving on to the next task.
You got it.
That's great.
You got it.
That's really helpful. Because otherwise it tries to do all of them simultaneously, and maybe it gets jumbled in the way it executes it, versus if you can say, hey, do this task, end task, do this next task, end this task. So you're kind of like bulk, almost like an assembly line, and it's executing one before moving on to the next.
Sometimes it's not reliable. It does work from like the left to right. It's like forcing things over more to the right, or even sometimes the order in which those nodes were created. But the end task is reliable. And
what happens if you copy that down and you have 2 end transactions? Does it execute still try to do both tasks? How does Dynamo, like, it's not linear, right? Based on the length of your script. Maybe this is I don't know, an immaterial question. It's not important, but I was trying to think of, like, if you're starting to create the different transaction, does it have to be linear in that fashion? Is that kind of a best practice versus having multiple kind of actions happening below or above this script?
I think it's probably very script specific.
Okay. Yeah, I was just trying to think it through, like how long it takes for a transaction to complete and the sequence of that, if it makes sense going left to right. Yeah. Again, using an assembly line
and like I said, it's super
analogy.
Like unreliable in terms of, because sometimes the order of operations might be deemed more important, so the actual placement doesn't matter. I've had some very strange inconsistencies with that, but the end transaction or transaction.end definitely helps with that.
That's great. I love it. Rob does say he had the issues with vertical and horizontal grids. He wanted to finish one before starting the next. So then maybe he could start gathering those horizontal grids, rename in transaction, then rename vertical grids.
You got it.
Okay.
You got it.
Cool. Good question, Rob. And keep those questions coming, guys. This is very good.
And that's pretty much all I had for my PowerPoint. Just once again, to kind of summarize, we can try to make our inputs more robust by using Booleans, by using conditional statements with Booleans, by using get item at index with a list.create and an integer slider, making those types of manipulations within your Dynamo graph. And of course, some of those little graphic manipulations that we talked about, those hacks, definitely make it more robust for your user. And then, of course, as we've all noticed, and I can even see here, the warnings issue is definitely a problem, right? Sometimes we just can't even anticipate it. You might get a null value in a model that, you had no way of anticipating that would be produced as a null, right?
Right.
So.
Yeah, really good comment. Muhammad is asking, he wants to become a hero for using Dynamo, quote unquote. He wants to know, what are you doing, Dana, to become a Dynamo hero?
Well, first off, I think it's like we kind of talked about in the beginning of spreading the word about how computation can be used. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And making those tools accessible in some way, whether that's internally using Dynamo Player, using Orchestra through data shapes, different things like that definitely make accessibility a non-issue, right? And I think that's the big thing. The moment that we have to create obstacles for our user to use these tools, it's going to break down, right? If they had a poor experience using the tool the first time, most likely they're not going to open it up a second time. Right. So making it super seamless, I think, is the first thing. But the second thing I would say is really just to educate yourself on, like we've been talking about, some of the practical uses of Dynamo and some of those scripts that can be utilized by, regardless of your discipline, regardless of when you are within your design process, thinking about some of these things. And of course, you can watch my Dynamo shorts on my DanamoBIM channel if you'd like to learn more about Dynamo.
That's great. Like it. Gets content over there. Rob had another question. He wanted to know, a lot of these transactions and tasks can be done with Python as well. So why not just use Python or bother with Dynamo if you could do it with Python?
Well, Rob, it seems like you definitely have a coding background, and I applaud that. Good for you. I wish I did. I wish that I could speak that language. And I work with Asan, who's the creator of PyRevit, really closely. He's helped me learn a bit of Python very slowly. So I'm very appreciative of him and his patience. But yes, 100%. The ease of use, the fact that it really does cut down that barrier to entry. And, you don't have to be a coder to do visual node-based coding. And using Python to supplement when maybe Dynamo doesn't do it natively or do it great, right? Like I was saying with the empty lists and the conditional statement out of the box node. So those types of things. But also, I would love it if my Revit users or the Dynamo Player users, after using it quite a bit, and they're like, I've been using Dynamo Player a lot this week. Probably be advantageous for me to start tinkering around in Dynamo. Right? And when they get into Dynamo, it's not horribly terrifying, right? And I mean, you've never seen that type of atmosphere, which I think that is kind of ending, especially with, kids out of college, they know coding, right? I mean, it's like a language that they learn. Fisher-Price toys teach you how to code now. So, those types of things I think are going to change really, really quickly going in the future. And maybe in the next generation of architects and engineers, Dynamo won't even be necessary because they will all know C# and Python and Java and, all of these other things to make, macros and buttons that we don't necessarily need Dynamo Player anymore.
Totally. Yeah, I'm very visual. Like I remember when I went to AU once and it was like, write your first Revit add-in, and like for me, it was very foreign. There was a lot of friction. And then when I started getting into Dynamo, it was more visual. And so I always call Dynamo kind of the gateway drug for programming, like in AEC, because that barrier to entry is much lower, I feel, than textual programming. And then what's cool about what your comment was, Dana, was, okay, if I'm in Dynamo and I'm using Dynamo Player a lot, maybe I can get in there and start fiddling with Dynamo. Where now maybe the next step is, oh, I see this Python node in here. What does that do? Let me double click that, open that up, and start editing Python. Would you say like that's a next kind of logical step once you started getting good at Dynamo, that you would start getting into Python? Is that maybe the next sequence of learning, or what's kind of the next step?
Absolutely. And luckily, as I mentioned a few times at this point, I work at Smith Group and we have a few developers on staff that are amazing. I know that I can contact them and be like, help, I'm horrible in Python and I don't want to cry today. So, they're really wonderful, but I also am very grateful for the package creators that have the Python in their custom nodes, because I can double click on them and start to look at them and tinker them, or maybe slightly change the output values, or, do it. And that in itself allows me to learn kind of bits and pieces incrementally of Python rather than, trying to go in full deep. It's like, just the toes in the pool.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. That's really great. Yeah, I'm the same at EvolveLAB. Like we have developers on staff and they know C# and Python and how to build UX, custom front end and the back end and how to connect all of it. And so like, for me too, like I'm very grateful to them, because it's like, oh man, I don't know how to do that. That's really helpful to have people that, and it's that synergy, right? It's like we all have our strengths. We all have things that we're good at and our superpowers, and then things we're not as good at. And then we're also always growing, like to always be learning constantly, not to get complacent, which is really good as a comment too. But I think it's really great. Any other thoughts or comments as it relates to Dynamo or Dynamo Player that you didn't mention that you wanted everyone to know about or to learn about, or successes or maybe challenges that, I don't know if you have a story of like you know, a time that you tried to implement in it and it was a lessons learned of why it didn't succeed? Do you have any kind of juicy stories about any Dynamo implementation that went well or didn't go well?
Juicy Dynamo stories. Well, I think a few things on to that topic. First off, to kind of feed off of what you were saying before, you know, we can't know everything. It's just impossible. But luckily, we are in a community of industry experts where we have forums, we have all of these different channels and outlets, we have these YouTube platforms, we have all these different things that, you know, obviously people are willing to give up their free time to share and help. So that in itself is incredible. And I think building up your network is key because like
Totally.
we can't know everything, right? So meeting people and having resources of making friends is definitely going to benefit you in this industry. And you know, if you're not necessarily a type of person to go out and introduce yourself, then post on the forums, you know, reply on the forums, you know, those types of things will definitely get you out there and make you known in terms of somebody who is doing things within computation. In terms of juicy stories, I don't think I've mentioned a firm name, but one of the last firms that I worked at, they loved right-aligned view titles. And I don't know whether you've ever had to work with right-aligned view titles, but up until recently, that wasn't part of the API. You couldn't control the location of the view title separate from the viewport itself, right? They were attached. You can move the viewport, but you can't move the viewport title. And I argued with them all day long about how this was just the worst waste of time. It's against national CAD standards. Like, why are you having people waste hours doing this, right? I mean, I'm sitting here creating tools to make your teams more efficient, and you're having people manually drag view titles to align with the right. And at that point, I found that I wasn't necessarily in the right room anymore. And I think that those conversations, those epiphanies are really hard sometimes to swallow. But that's how we make ourselves better. That's how we further our career path. That's how we, you know, better our professional path, if you will. And I think, you know, pushing yourself and trying to not just be comfortable drawing lines and creating filled regions, you know, asking why is something, unfortunately, has gotten me into trouble quite a bit in my life, but has also pushed me into, you know, wanting to ask those questions, wanting to push the buttons and push the boundaries. And if you are one of those people, believe me, it will pay off.
Totally. So network is really important. Asking the why questions, iron sharpening iron, right? So learning from each other, talking to people that disagree with you and listening, also voicing opinion, and then also the forums, which also ties into the community aspect, right? Which I find still with the advent of the internet is incredible, you know, to be able to have that community. And if you have a question, people are so welcoming on the Dynamo forum and in that space to help answer questions that you have. So that's really great. Very cool, Dana. Well, we are at top of the hour. Dana, I'm so appreciative for you coming on and teaching us about Dynamo and Dynamo Player, and especially some of the tips. Like, I've learned a lot in this. It's been really, really helpful for me personally. So, and I hope it's been helpful for everyone else. We really appreciate you, and check out Dana on DanamoBIM YouTube and see what she has going on over there. Really appreciate you, and thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Bill.